Hello, and welcome to Hedgehog Storytime, where I read my weird original fiction. This is Chapter 2 of my novel Theone. Read Chapter 1 and the prologue first. Duh. So this is the conclusion of Chapter 2, the second half of Chapter 2. This is the longest chapter in the whole novel. And this will be the last chapter I read on the channel. If y'all are interested in Theone in the future or whatever, totally let me know, because this is one of the projects that I'd be looking into publishing or self-publishing or whatever. There could be Kickstarters in the future. Who the hell knows? So just let me know if you liked it. Let me know if you didn't like it. Let me know what you think I could change. I'm always looking for critiques. So thank you very much, and enjoy the second chapter of Theone. The Favored. How much further? Cal complained as the three children waded through the dense foliage, trying their hardest not to seriously disturb any of the vegetation. Opening his mouth to make the most sarcastic comment that he could possibly muster, Farrell rolled his eyes, but Billy turned to him then, silencing him with a glare before he could get anything out. "Not long now," she said quietly, leading the way through the woods. More like an oven with this humidity, Farrell thought to himself. He could feel the beads of sweat forming on his forehead, and he ran a hand through his hair, which was growing damper by the second, and he thought that fall was coming. It had been cool enough yesterday that Mella was able to wear her scarf. It was so large and bright red, and Farrell's insides hurt thinking about how much he usually laughed at seeing her so dwarfed in comparison. The thought of her happy just made his stomach queasy. He had this uncanny feeling that every second they dawdled was a second wasted. If this was some sort of sickness that Mella had, well, sometimes illnesses got better, but a lot of times they got worse, too. "Did you hear that?" Cal gasped then, making Farrell jump. His hand hovered over the small sword that he always kept at his belt, but Belize slapped it away. "No," she whispered. "Someone could get hurt. Do you even know how to use that thing, Cal?" Cal's eyes narrowed indignantly. "Of course I do," he said. "You jab people you don't like with the pointy end. How hard can it be?" "I don't think it's quite that simple," Belize sighed. "Where did you even find that thing, anyway?" "It was stuck on a rock just outside the village, and I pulled it out. That means it's special." Meanwhile, Farrell had been glancing this way and that, trying to find the source of the disturbance, real or imagined, that Cal had brought to their attention. He shrugged. "I don't see anything. We should keep moving." Cal began to relax. "You're right." They quickly began walking again. After a few moments, a strange roaring sound reached Farrell's ear, and it only grew louder as they kept going. Soon, the three children came to a ravine. The sun shone down on the glistening red rocks and the water far below, which both shined like diamonds. They all paused for a moment, taking in the beautiful sight. "Yes, this is it," Billy smiled, looking relieved. "We're almost there." The three crossed the rickety bridge without hesitation. Having lived in the trees all of their lives, they were used to the sway of the wood slats under their feet. That sense of urgency that had struck Farrell earlier seemed to be affecting all of them now. Their feet pounded down the wood, the ropes holding it all together, creaking under their weight, but none of them really noticed. Frogs hopped, rope bridges creaked, Cal stuck out his tongue when he ran out of mean things to say. These were just the facts of life. When they were back under the canopy of the large trees, Billy began to mutter, half to herself. "The path goes this way." She pointed straight ahead of them, to where a thin path traced its way beneath the vegetation. "But I'm almost positive that we go this way instead." Farrell could have sworn that he heard the rope bridge behind them creak again, but he shook himself. It was probably just the wind, or his mind playing tricks on him. Billy began to walk off through the woods, away from the path, with Cal in tow. Farrell ran to catch up to them. "Keep up, stupid!" Cal shouted back to him. "Oh, yeah?" said Farrell, right behind him now. "Well, your face is stupid." "Wow!" Farrell could hear him rolling his eyes. "That was incredibly original. Where'd you ever come up with that one?" "Shh!" Billy interrupted, pausing mid-stride. "Ursa's cave is right through here, but does something feel wrong to you two?" Farrell's eyes narrowed. Now that he thought about it, the woods did suddenly seem unnaturally quiet. "You're right," he said, his feet beginning to shuffle of their own accord. "Cal, I'd keep that sword handy." Despite the order, Cal didn't look like he was about to bash Farrell's face in. He reached for the sword and gripped it tightly. Then he nodded. Farrell looked at him, then at Billy, who seemed just as scared as Farrell felt. Taking a deep breath, he glanced at his two friends and nodded. The three children pushed aside the vegetation and walked into the clearing beyond. Something was wrong here. Farrell could tell that right away. There was Ursa's cave, sitting between the wide trees, a hole scooped into the cliff face at the edge of the clearing. It almost seemed to be watching him. There were animals here, too, which was certainly normal. He'd been told by the others like Billy who'd met Ursa that animals practically flocked to her. But these animals did nothing to calm his nerves. They stood stock still, as if frozen in place, and many of them were covered in black patches of fur or skin, much like... Farrell's eyes widened. It was exactly like the plant that Mela touched. They didn't impede the children's approach to the cave at first, just watched them, their eyes glassy. Farrell shivered. He had seen a dead bird once, stinking and half devoured by maggots, lying on the forest floor, and that was what its eyes looked like. The animals still didn't attack, but now with every step the children took towards the cave, they also took one step to bar their entrance. But they didn't move like deer and rabbits and badgers and other things moved. Instead, they all stepped together like they were smaller parts of some bigger thing. Farrell stopped walking. The other two following his lead, the animals stopped as well. Ursa? Bully called into the cave. It's me, Bully. Is something wrong? Wherever they were located in and around the clearing, every animal, bird, beaver, absolutely everything turned directly towards the children, who instinctively huddled together. Cal drew his sword. Stay back! He stuttered, as if they could possibly understand him. Don't let them touch you, said Farrell. They're sick. It's the thing that Mela has. Bully looked this way and that, trying to find a way out of the circle of mechanical forest creatures. Something's definitely not right. Ursa's always in her cave and... Oh, she's in her cave, all right, said a new voice. The children turned, but they were unable to locate the source. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. But she's not going to answer anytime soon. What have you done to her? Bully asked the air, her voice shaking. The voice chuckled. Nothing lasting. She's just taking a little nap now. She was so awfully tired. Winter is coming after all. Who are you? Cal's voice faltered for a moment. His sword visibly shook in his hands. A laugh came from the trees, as if they themselves were chuckling at the scared children, but that laugh almost seemed familiar to him, and Farrell's heart stopped beating for a moment. He knew that laugh. Yet somehow it all seemed wrong, too hollow, too forced, almost like a mockery of a laugh. Oh, you sillies, said the voice. It's only me. Two of the peculiar deer in front of Farrell moved smoothly sideways, and the brambles shook as Mela emerged from the trees. But this was definitely not the Mela that he knew. There was something inexplicably gone from her. She smiled, and yet she didn't, like that grin was painted there. Her eyes were glassy like the animals', and her head hung limply to the side as she stared them down. Trails of the black ran from her eyes like tears. It was also unlike her to be floating a foot off of the ground. Mela glided closer to the three other children, still with that constant, insane grin plastered on her face. Mela? Cal asked. What's wrong with you? Cal. Farrell leaned in his direction to hiss in his biggish ears. I don't think that's Mela anymore. Mela scoffed. Of course I'm myself, she said, her head flopping limply the other way. Just better. She slid still closer, and Bully whimpered. Anyway, continued Mela, I'm going to give you a choice. Either you turn around right now and forget that this ever happened, or unfortunately, she sighed for dramatic effect, I'm going to have to kill you. Cal's eyes widened. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. Mela, he stammered, why? Because he wants me to do it. He's whispering to me, even now. So beautiful. The beast is beautiful. Please let us through. We need to see Ursa, Bully demanded, regaining some of her confidence. She can make you better. We can fix this. Zooming forward suddenly, Mela only stopped when she was an inch away from Bully's face. And what if I don't want to get better? The puppet-like animals took a step inward, crowding the children together. I have a destiny. The beast has chosen me to aid in his greatest creation in the making of a new world, a beautiful world. She smiled, her eyes wide and wild, the pupils mere dots. Farrell shivered. But he took a deep breath. They had to get to Ursa. It was the only way. Well, I guess you're just going to have to kill us then. Wait a second, Farrell, Cal interjected. Can't we talk about this? Bully shook her head. No. Her eyes narrowed. I know what this is now. Who's done this to her? Maybe. I'm waiting, Mela intoned, beginning to hum a strange tune to herself now. Ursa told me something the last time I was here. Something about a hero who lived a long time ago, Bully said hurriedly. What does an old story have to do with this? Cal hissed. Giving him a sharp look, Bully continued. She said that he fought against creatures covered in black, controlled by someone or something called the Beast. She wasn't sure if there was a cure, but she was working on it. We need to get to Ursa somehow, Farrell gritted his teeth. Then, whispering, I'll deal with Mela. You two get to her. They nodded. Farrell turned back to Mela, who's humming at a crease in volume. We're not leaving. Mela simply laughed. Suit yourselves. She raised her hands to the air, and more of the substanceless black converged there, seemingly conjured out of the air itself. The animals promptly came to life and began to charge. Bully screamed in fright as she barely dodged a swarm of flies that flew over her head and ran towards the cave. Farrell had to kick a poor bunny rabbit that bared its teeth and tried to sink them into the flesh of his arm. But as a buck began to charge towards him, its antlers sharp and deadly, Cal just froze. Cal! Farrell shouted. Move! But still Cal stayed exactly where he was, staring into the dead eyes of that creature that was about ready to impale him. Farrell hated him more than anyone else, but he couldn't help the images of Cal's chest being pierced by those bone-shattering antlers that flashed through his mind. Closer, closer. Why hadn't he moved? That idiot! 2 more seconds and Cal would be a shish kebab! He couldn't take it. Farrell dashed over, praying that he wasn't too late. Plowing directly into him, Farrell pushed Cal out of the way as he felt an antler brush the back of his head. They landed in a heap as the buck flew past. It soon skidded to a halt, turning around and snorting. It realized its error. This time it wouldn't miss. You idiot! Farrell shouted as Cal cowered. If you're not gonna fight, then hand over that sword. But the buck was getting closer. Now! Cal passed him the sword, and Farrell gouged a long gash on the buck's side, and almost roared. He had never heard a deer make any kind of sound, let alone that one, and ran for the trees, leaving a trail of dark blood behind it. Farrell gripped the sword tightly. He had never used one before, had never had any need to, and he hoped that it was as easy as Cal seemed to think it was. Meanwhile, Bully had reached the cave and tried to run into it. She cried out as she instead ran into the empty air, a wall of some kind, invisible. I can't get to her, she cried, and Mela laughed. Poor children, she mock-whimpered. Your one plan has failed. I guess that all you can do now is die. Her green eyes darkened for a moment, and all of the animals barreled towards Bully in an attempt to finish her off, but she didn't look the least bit frightened anymore, just angry. No! Farrell shouted, but there was no need. Quick as a fox, Bully leaped up the nearest tree, almost floated even, and pulled out the slingshot she kept tied to her belt. I'm fine! She yelled down to him over the various noises the animals made. But we need to get to Ursa, now! And there's only one way to do that. Farrell's eyes widened. He knew exactly what she meant. The only way open to them now was to go through Mela. But I thought Mela was the reason to come here. I'm sorry, Farrell. I lied. She's not the reason. You are. What? There's no time. Please, you have to end this. Farrell shook his head. No, I can't. Do it, she shouted. Hurry! Some of the more agile animals began to climb her tree. Yeah, Farrell. Mela laughed. Do it. Just try. She clenched her fist, and the black arranged itself into a shadowy axe bigger than her head. One thing was clear as Farrell wiped away tears. His friend was gone. Mela swooped down, swinging her axe, and Farrell barely managed to block it, the blade of his sword groaning under the pressure. She cackled. You're weak. My master has nothing to worry about. Farrell's eyes flared. His blood boiled. Then his mind just froze. As if in a trance, Farrell had no control over himself. He screamed from a place deep within and swung at her with his sword. Once, twice, 3 times. Mela blocked each one, but shakily, the large axe heavy for her frail frame. Then he undercut, and the deadly blade was knocked from her hands. It landed on the ground without a sound and dissipated into the air. Mela screamed inhumanly, and Farrell's bones chattered. She began to speed towards him, the black streaming down her fingers and spewing from her eyes, but Farrell was ready. Wait, Farrell, don't! It was Cal, almost crying from across the clearing where the animals had mostly left him alone. He stood, stretching his hand towards Farrell as if that could stop him. Farrell paused, but it was not enough. He looked up again, and Mela's face, horribly distorted, her eyes bulging as the black tears bubbled and spit, was just an inch away from his own, and without thinking, a reflex, Farrell stabbed. Mela's gut-twisting scream shook the trees for a split second as, with a horrible cracking sound, Farrell's sword jabbed through her skull and directly into her left eye. The blood, the bright red, horrible blood, ran down her face, mingling with the black. It stained her red scarf with an even darker shade of crimson, and she stared at him with the other eye, a single tear running from it. For 1 second, she was Mela again. Her old self, but she didn't speak. He didn't think she could, but her mouth twitched into the smallest of smiles before the light left her eyes. Farrell stared down at the body of his friend as he regained some semblance of control over himself. He began to shake a little, but soon more and more. Unable to look away from the former body of his best friend, who he just sliced clean through, Farrell didn't breathe, didn't feel his heartbeat. He felt just as dead as she was, felt the phantom pain on his face as if it was his own. What a horrible way to die. Before he could even open his mouth or begin to form a coherent thought, Cal spoke for him. You, he faltered. You killed her. Cal began to back away towards the trees, shaking his head as if he didn't quite believe it himself. You, he said again, then, his eyes widening. You monster! Farrell started. How could you? He shouted. I can't believe... But he didn't get any more out before the tears started streaming down his face in earnest, and he turned and ran into the forest. Looking down at her on the ground for a minute, Farrell felt numb, his mind blank as he absently watched the blood drip down her beautiful face. He wrenched the sword out of her skull, and bits of brain matter and yet more gooey red splattered onto his face. She was dead. His friend, his best friend, maybe his only true friend in the world, had stopped breathing. The thoughts like tiny seeds began to sprout in his mind, then came faster and faster. Why had she touched the black? Why did I let her? Why did I kill her? I didn't have a choice. You could have found another way. There was no other way, but there might have been, but there wasn't. How could you, Farrell? How could you? I had hoped that it wouldn't come to this, said a voice, low and rough. Farrell turned as an enormous bear emerged from Ursa's cave. The blackened animals, who had been stunned a second before, shook themselves and ran at the creature's presence. Scurrying down from her tree, Billy breathed a sigh of relief. Ursa, she said, I'm glad you're okay. What happened? She wrapped her arms around the great bear's neck, and Ursa, though theoretically not possessing the facial muscles to do such a thing, somehow managed to smile. I'm afraid the magic of the beast is stronger than I'd anticipated. She bowed her head. I had no idea it could consume one of you, let alone Mela. You all loved her. Farrell didn't say anything, just looked down at the ground. Please, boy, Ursa intoned, don't remember her like that. She wouldn't want to be thought of as the monster she became. It was trying to get to him. Bully motioned to Farrell. Ursa nodded. Indeed. Wait, Farrell said, raising his head. What? There are so many things you need to know, Ursa sighed, lumbering closer, her brown fur rippling around her shoulders and haunches. And we are unfortunately short on time. I should have called for you much sooner. She sat back and motioned for the two children to do likewise. Long ago, the black had run out of control, corrupting everything it touched. The black, Farrell paused for a moment. Is that what infected He couldn't even say her name. Nodding, Ursa continued. It came from the other, a place outside of our world, and soon it became strong enough that a great beast, a child of that place, was able to use it to form an army. His goal? To destroy the world and build a new one of his own design. Bully gasped. Farrell frowned. But he obviously didn't succeed. Ursa nodded. A hero arose, and with the help of a powerful sword he was able to kill the beast. Farrell opened his mouth, but Ursa continued on. You're going to ask how the black can be back if the beast is dead, and I'm just as confused as you, but know this. The black has returned, and the beast will soon follow. So what does this have to do with me? If the beast is to return, so must the hero. Their destinies are entwined, you see. And that, my dear boy, is you. Eyes widening, Farrell leaned forward. Me? He asked. How could you possibly know? I could talk conjecture for hours. Ursa rolled her big brown eyes. But time is of the essence, and I must tell you that you are about to begin a journey. It may seem terrifying or maddening at times, but you must always keep moving forward. Me? A hero, he spat out. I have to go on a journey? How? Where do I even start? Farrell shouted in anguish, standing now. What do I do? How can I stop something so scary? You just did, didn't you? Yes. Now that he thought about it, he had stood up to something terrifying, horrific even. An invisible needle pierced his heart again as he was reminded of Mela. He sat back down, stunned into silence. I have no idea where your journey will take you, or how you'll be able to accomplish such a feat, Ursa blinked solemnly, but I do know where to begin. You'll need to find an artifact of great power, and a person to lead you to it. This person happens to be a princess of a great kingdom outside of the forest. Outside the forest? But I've never been... I know. Ursa cut him off with a nod. But I believe you'll be fine. She stood, shook out her fur. Now you must go, quickly. The beast will be following you. But Go, Ursa commanded, turning back to her cave. Every second you waste is another second for the black to become stronger. Farrell watched her go, helpless and confused. How could he be a hero? He was just a kid who had picked up a sword for the first time today. The beast sounded so powerful, and far too great a power for him to face alone. Why him? Why choose him to be a hero? Why not Billy, or Mela, another needle prick to the heart, or even Cal? Oh yes, Cal. Cal's sword. He'd want it back, no doubt. Farrell could find another. The village was closer to the edge of the forest than Ursa's cave was anyway, and he wanted to say goodbye to his friends. The edge of the forest, though. That made him shiver. Anything could be beyond the trees. What if he fell into the sky the instant he set foot outside? But wasn't that what he wanted? To see what was out there in the world? Billy stood then, brushing the dirt and moss from a rough-spun skirt. "You should get going," she said. "I'll deal with—" She turned to where Mela was still laying, but couldn't finish. "All right," said Farrell softly. "Just give me a minute." Billy nodded, disappearing like a ghost into the trees. Approaching the body on the ground, Farrell hesitated. He wanted to barf, or run away, or cry, but he didn't do any of those things. He covered her ruined eye and looked down at her perfect face, only marred by the black lines running down her cheeks. She almost looked like she was simply sleeping, like if he shook her she might wake and smile up at him as she always did. Farrell turned away, ready to leave, when his foot caught on something. Looking down, Mela's scarf seemed to have wrapped itself around his foot, as if it didn't want him to go. It was already so bright red that you could only see the blood if you squinted. Farrell smiled a little. Seeing that scarf made him feel a little better. Carefully, trying not to disturb her too much, he reached behind her head and grabbed, pulling it through gently, carefully, and he whipped it around his own neck. As he whipped it around his own neck, Farrell breathed deeply. It smelled like her, sweet and musty. Turning away for good this time, Farrell took a deep breath and walked off through the woods. He was still sad, a stone placed on his heart that he wasn't sure would ever go away, but now he felt just a little bit better. Wherever he went now, however far his journey took him, Mela would be there by his side. The walk back through the trees was uneventful, if quiet. It seemed as if the whole forest was in mourning. The woods were beginning to cool as the sun began its descent in the sky above. Normally, distracted as he was, Farrell probably would have gotten hopelessly lost, but it seemed that luck was on his side, because before long he found himself back at the village, the walkways over his head creaking slightly in the breeze. No one was about. The whole village was silent. Farrell felt a sudden sense of unease. There was always something happening in the village. Parties, games, small feet running across the network of bridges. Had something happened? Farrell opened his mouth to call out to someone, but then, one by one, they began to appear. Soon, most of the children in the village had emerged from their houses and looked down at him. No one said a word. Some of them looked confused or scared, but most stared him down, anger alight in their eyes. What was going on? What had he done? Then, Cal appeared from behind a tree, his face twisted in rage. "What are you doing here?" Farrell shook his head, confused. "What do you mean? I live here." "Not anymore." Cal took a step forward, his fist clenched so hard that his knuckles ran white. "Not since you killed someone. There are no killers here." "But you were there," Farrell shouted. "I didn't have a choice, you know that. She would have killed me, and Billy, and you." Cal grimaced. "Well, maybe you should have let her." Stunned into silence, all of Farrell's fight went out of him like a river. "All right," he said finally. "Fine. I'm leaving anyway." "What?" Cal asked, surprised. "Just like that?" "What?" Cal asked, surprised. "Just like that?" "Yeah," said Farrell. "Here's your sword." He shoved it at him and started walking determinedly away, trying so hard not to cry. "Wait," Cal said after a moment, and Farrell turned once more. "Keep it," he said, holding it out to him. You have no idea what could be out there." Farrell hesitated. "You're not going to kick me on the way out?" "I should, after what you did to Mela." Every word was punctuated with menace. "You want to try?" "No." Cal backed up, frightened by the look in Farrell's eyes. There was something different about him now. They could all see that. He had taken a life. From that there was no going back. "I just want you to leave." Beginning its long trek to he didn't know where, Farrell turned around, simply too tired to fight any more. "And don't come back!" Cal called after him. Farrell didn't look back.